one question that we have to look at is whether the next Philippine president, depending on the candidate, will have a significant bearing in terms of our foreign policy calibrations. And of course, one country that everyone asks about is China, how our relationship with China changes. And believe me, throughout the last 3 or 4 months, I have had engagements with people in the business sector, people in the armed forces of the Philippines, people in the policy-making circles, and this is one of the questions that always they ask me, what do you think will happen with the next president, depending on which candidate wins? I think this kind of questions are legitimate because if you look at the Philippines' foreign policy throughout the last 10 years, there seems to have been some significant shift in terms of our relations with China. So many people, I among them, agree that from 2004 to 2007, we had a short-lived golden age of bilateral relations with China. So if you followed the GMA administration's foreign policy in 2004, we faced a critical juncture where we had to make a difficult decision. This was a time when a Filipino OFW in Iraq, Angela de la Cruz, I'm sorry. Oh, is it Ray? Angela de la Cruz, well, that guy also died. But Angela de la Cruz was taken hostage by a group that eventually will become actually ISIS. This was the Al-Qaeda in Iraq branch in 2004. And the option was this: if we do not withdraw our contingent, which was part of the coalition of the willing or coalition of the coerced, depending on how you want to put it, then he would have been beheaded. Of course, Arroyo was put in this proverbial between a hard rock and a hard place. If she did not withdraw our contingent troops, he would have most likely been beheaded. These ISIS guys don't have to make jokes, right? And that would have sparked a national backlash. And actually, she was already reading from very controversial elections during that time, and elections that she promised she will not run in to begin with. So this is a Hello Garci period. And the hard place, of course, was the United States, not very implicit threat under the Bush administration that if we withdraw our contingent, that would have an impact in terms of their foreign military financing and other kind of aid to us. Remember, the Bush doctrine was Manichaean. Either you're with us or you're against us. And eventually, as a good politician, she made a decision that she rather survives domestically first before dealing with the foreign policy conundrum. So she chose to withdraw the contingent that pissed off the Bush administration. The Australians called us a basket case in Asia. But the next thing she did was to immediately go and meet Hu Jintao in Beijing. And it was a fascinating meeting because during that meeting, not only did we sign the usual trade and investment deals, in fact, China offered us military aid, and there was also a promise of great relations between our armed forces and our defense colleges. And this is the beginning of a very short-lived chapter in our golden relations with China. Over the next 2 years, several major projects and initiatives will come on board. By 2005, we signed the Joint Maritime Seismic Undertaking together with the Vietnamese and the Chinese. And by 2006, you had the implementation of the massive NBNZT project in order to create a national highway of broadband network for the Philippines. But of course, one thing fascinating is, I'm not very proud of this, or I don't. I did a project with the guys in the WikiLeaks, and they asked me to go through diplomatic cables from 1980s, or actually 70s, up until 2010. And one thing I noticed was, in the American diplomatic cables, both the embassy here and the guys in Washington, D.C., you see that the golden age was so impressive that even the American embassy was supportive of the JMSU. Right. In one cable, they said, we see this as a constructive way forward in settling intractable territorial disputes. In another cable, when Jiabao, the premier of China, visited the Philippines, the cable actually suggested from Manila that we see this as a normal part of China's charm offensive in the region. So even the American embassy was impressed by the kind of golden relationship we had with them. But of course, everything immediately went south in 2007, right, when it was discovered that the NBNZTE was riddled with corruption and kickbacks. And of course, the timing was very suspicious because it came shortly after us signing the JMSU. And soon, our leftist friends came out with exposés showing that the JMSU violated our constitution. It's something that has to be settled, but actually, if you look into details of it, it makes sense. Because, for instance, one of the important clauses and provisions of the JMSU was secrecy. I mean, it's really there. It says secrecy. But we know that our Constitution mandates the executive government to engage in consultation with other branches in situations whereby our national patrimony provisions of Constitution are under question. And the JMSU is a joint development, and it actually ate into our 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone. Now, of course, things went even more interesting when it was discovered that some of the areas covered by the JMSU were not actively claimed by China. So you don't have to be an expert to say that, well, we had this very controversial JMSU deal with China. The next year we had these major economic projects with possibly tens of millions of dollars of kickbacks. So in short, it looked like bribery. Of course, things were even more complicated when the North Railway project was declared as unconstitutional because the bidding process itself seemed to have been rigged. So this is it, the very moment when we thought that we're going to have a new qualitative relationship with China. And to be honest, we have to credit Madame Arroyo, because she's one of the first presidents who played very effectively this equibalancing strategy of playing great powers against each other. One of the things I hate about discussion in typical foreign affairs is that, oh, small countries, we have limited room for maneuver. But as someone has observed small countries like Singapore or Vietnam over the years, when you're a small country, the best strategy is to play big powers against each other. And Arroyo was doing that. Now, of course, the question was the intention for our national interests, or was the intention for our own political survival, if not worse, for corruption? So when Aquino came into power, of course, the whole Dan Matuid mantra meant a full rejection, a Hegelian antithesis to the kind of pro-China, corruption-riddled position that was developed by the Arroyo administration. But there's a big catch here. If you observe, from 2010 to 2011, in fairness to President Aquino, he tried to actually appease China. I'm not saying engagement, actually appease China. So in 2010, Liu Xiaobo, a human rights activist in China, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And Aquino was invited to actually attend the ceremony in Norway. He turned down the attendance, and he ended up joining people like Putin, Mugabe, all sorts of dictators around the world who boycotted the event. And the ambassador of China here in Manila actually openly thanked President Aquino for not attending that. And of course that was embarrassing because his mother was nominated for a Peace Prize. His parents are democratic icons. So he tried to do that to signal to China that we're willing to find some sort of accommodation here. As much as I'm rejecting the Arroyo administration and the things that she did in the past, I'm realistic enough to recognize that we should have, as neighbors, some reasonable accommodation on our disputes. In 2011, he visited China and he met President Hu Jintao, and there was a promise to increase bilateral trade from $30 billion to $60 billion. So up until 2011, middle of 2011, even Aquino was trying to reach some sort of accommodation with China. And this is where I think you have to be fair to President Aquino. By late 2011, we realized that the Chinese mean business, and not in the way we want. They began to harass our energy exploration activities close to Reed Bank. And if you're familiar with the data, you know that the Malampaya plant is running out in the next 2 decades. And Reed Bank is our gateway to energy security. And to have us being harassed there, after all of those accommodations and engagements that Aquino conducted, I think created this sense of betrayal, right? That this is a country we cannot trust. And by 2012, all hell broke loose when they took away Scarborough Shoal from us. Of course, we can go to the details. I don't have time with that. One of the most ridiculous things we did was we sent Gregorio del Pilar to apprehend the Chinese fishermen. Anyone familiar with standard operating procedures knows that you don't send a gray hull for a law enforcement activity. We were supposed to send the Coast Guard. But the moment we sent a gray hull, we gave a perfect excuse to the Chinese to send a whole armada of Coast Guard forces, which are better armed than our Coast Guard turned frigate, Gregorio del Pilar. And the next thing we knew, we were checkmated. And the Americans did not help us. That was a good reminder of the limits of the commitment of Americans to us. What am I trying to tell you? What I'm trying to tell you is that in the last 10 years alone, you have this significant shift, right, in terms of our relations with China. Today, the Philippines is the only country that has filed a case against China at an international court. And most likely, we'll get a favorable outcome. Today, Aquino is the only leader in East Asia who has not yet held a single formal dialogue or summit with Mr. Xi Jinping. And for this reason, I've called the Philippine-China relations as the most toxic relation in East Asia. So you see huge swing in bilateral relations. Of course, in 8 minutes I summarized that. From golden age to now the most toxic relationship. So the logical question is, if Aquino is out and we have a different president, does that mean that suddenly the relations are going to go back to the past? Or are going to go back to what we had during the Ramos administration, which was something like a cold peace, right? Not too war, but not also confrontational, right? To the point that your president on 2 occasions likens China to Nazi Germany.